So once again, we're jumping to section 5.1, chapter 5, that is. We jump from 2, skipping 3 and 4, jumping to 5. We will go back to 3 and 4 later. But right now we're going to start solving inequalities. And on this first section of solving inequalities, we're going to be solving one-step inequalities. I think maybe even some simple two-step inequalities. So let's start with this. Solving an inequality is almost exactly the same as solving an equation. The only difference is if you multiply or divide everything by a negative number, you must flip the inequality symbol. Okay? And I've also seen or have written these notes down as if you multiply or divide by a negative on your last step, then you must flip the inequality symbol. So whenever you multiply or divide by a negative, you must flip the inequality. Okay? When you multiply or divide by a negative, you must flip the inequality symbol. So go ahead and jot that down in your notebooks, and then we'll move on to some examples. So, what we're going to do is make some space here. And I'm just going to write an inequality. Something like, let's say, 2, that's not good. 2x minus, give me a number.
6.
6 is less than or equal to, give me a number.
3.
4. Okay, so we have an inequality. It kind of looks like an equation. The only difference is that you have an inequality right here instead of an equal sign. So let's just solve this the same exact way, right? Now, remember, in our notes over here in blue, the only difference is if you multiply or divide everything by a negative, okay? Multiply or divide everything by a negative. So let's start solving this thing. What's the first thing to do? To get rid of the minus 6. So you're going to go plus 6. Plus 6. Are we multiplying by a negative? No. So you don't have to worry about anything. You just bring everything down the way you normally would. 2x. Bring down the equal sign, but it's not an equal sign. It's an inequality. And 4 plus 6 is 10. Okay. So what do I do next to solve to get x by itself? Divide by 2. Okay, so you're going to divide by 2. Divide by 2. Cancels. And your answer is x. Now, I didn't divide by a negative, right? Remember the notes that we had up there in blue, it says if you multiply or divide by a negative, that's when you have to flip the inequality symbol. So right here, it's just the same exact inequality symbol coming down through each step. And 10 divided by 2 is 5. And that's it. That's your answer. You see, it's easy. Now, the only other thing that they could ask you to do is to graph this solution. Okay? So let's go to a quick number line. Let's do a quick number line. And let's put the number 5 right here in the middle. Let's fill in a couple of values to the left and to the right. So to the left, remember, anything on the left side is less. So that would be 4 and 3. Anything on the right side is greater, 6 and 7. And now we need to graph the answer. Now what do I mean by graph the answer? This is the answer right here. X is less than or equal to 5. Okay, so is 4 less than or equal to 5? Yes. Is 3 less than or equal to 5? Yes. Is 0 less than or equal to 5? Yes. Is negative 50 less than or equal to 5? Yeah, so you're talking about an infinite amount of answers. That's why we're going to graph the solution here. Okay. How about this? Let me ask you this. Is 4.5 less than or equal to 5? Yes. Is 4.9 less than or equal to 5? Yes. Is 5 less than or equal to 5? Yes. So when you go to your graph, you're going to put a solid dot. I did it open, but I want to fill it in. So make a solid dot in there, color it in, because it is including the 5. Now, less than is to the left. And that would be the graph of that solution. Okay? I guess we could jot down some more notes here. Whoa. So let me move that a little to the side. Make it a little smaller. Let me jot down some notes here. So here's some additional notes. Once you actually solve it, if you have an inequality with a solid line underneath it, then it will be a solid dot. Okay? So as you can see, our answer I mean, our original inequality had a solid line underneath it, and it kept coming down, so you have a solid line underneath it on your answer, so it's going to be a solid dot. If it did not have a solid line underneath it, then it would be an open dot. So if I tell you, like, let's say we're working on a problem, and x is greater than 2. Okay, well then you would go to a number line, and you would put the number 2, fill in some values, 3, 1, and in this case, since there is no solid line underneath the inequality, it's not going to be a solid dot, it's going to be an open dot. And you just go, what does it say? It says x is greater than 2. Greater than is always to the right. All right, so this is just another example. I didn't even solve it. I just said if you solved it and you got x is greater than 2, then it'll be an open dot, and greater than is to the right. Less than is to the left. You guys get it? Piece of cake? It is easy. Okay, but I still haven't demonstrated that this has all been exactly the same as solving equations. I haven't demonstrated where you multiply or divide by a negative on your last step. So let me create another inequality. Let me bring this up here and just create another one. Let me go with the 5 take away 2x is greater than, give me an odd number. 7, somebody said. Okay. So let's say we had this inequality and they asked us to solve it. Let's say they said solve and graph, because on the quiz they are going to ask you to do that, or I'll ask you to do that, solve and graph on a number line. So if I wanted to solve this thing, solve and graph. Okay, what's the first step to do? Subtract 5, because there's a 5 there, you could get rid of it. Remember, you want to solve, you want to get x by itself. Of course, you want to get rid of the 5 and the 2, but you get rid of the 5 first. So you subtract 5 on both sides. Whoops. And I want to bring down everything. Minus 2x. The inequality is going to stay the same. Why? Because I did not multiply or divide by a negative. Okay? Now, right here on my last step, what do I have to do? Divide by a negative 2. Okay, I need to divide by a negative 2. So right there is where you have to flip the inequality symbol. So you to get x, you would flip the inequality symbol, and it would become negative 1, and that's your answer. Again, the only difference between solving an equation and solving an inequality is that if you multiply or divide by a negative on your last step, you have to flip that inequality symbol to look the opposite direction. Okay? That's only when you multiply or divide by a negative value. Again, if this would have been a positive 2x, you would be dividing by positive 2, dividing by positive 2, you wouldn't flip it. But because it's a negative 2x, you're dividing by a negative, you have to flip the inequality symbol. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy. There's some that are so easy. Like let's say you have a negative x is less than 1/2. And I asked you to solve it. How would you solve that? You got to get x by itself. What do? You just either divide by a negative 1 or multiply by a negative 1. You want to get a positive x. You don't want that negative x, right? So I'm going to, let's say, multiply by a negative 1. And what I do to one side, I do to the other side. Multiply by a negative 1. Now right here I am multiplying by a negative, or dividing by a negative for that matter. You could say divided by negative 1 if you wanted to. So the bottom line, your final answer will be x, but you have to flip that inequality symbol because you divided by a negative, or because you multiplied by a negative. So this is going to become a negative 1/2. And there's your answer. I guess I forgot to do the graphing portion of this. Let's actually do it. If I had x is greater than negative 1/2, well, I would put some numbers. 1, 2, 3, 0, negative 1, and so on and so on. So on my number line, where do I go? What value do I go to? Do I go to 1, 2? Where do I go? Negative 1/2, which is between the 0 and the negative 1. Now, is this going to be an open dot or a solid dot? Open, because it does not have a solid line underneath it. Remember, if it has a solid line, it will be a solid dot. But it doesn't have a solid line underneath it, so it's going to be an open dot halfway from 0 to negative 1. So you all put that open dot, and now we just need to say, okay, this is saying x is greater than negative 1/2. Which way is greater than? To the left or to the right? To the right. So So there's my answer. There's my graph that represents that answer. I hope this helps. What do you guys think? So ladies and gentlemen, we have our first homework assignment from this section, and it's ridiculously easy. What do I mean by that? We're never going to, if you look at all these problems on this first worksheet I just handed out, there is no negative x. So you're never going to be dividing by a negative. So you're not really going to be flipping any inequalities. So let's just do number one here. Let's zoom in here. Number one, you want to get x by itself. And probably number one is the most confusing type of question on this assignment right here. So you want to get x by itself. What are you going to do? Add 15. Cancels. Add 15. I end up with what on the left side? Negative or positive 7, yeah, is greater than or equal to x. Now when we say positive 7 is greater than or equal to x, we don't want to talk about positive 7. You want to talk about x, right? So in other words, you don't want the x on this side and the 7 on this side. You want to flip the whole thing. So if you move the x to the left side and the 7 to the right side, this is your answer right here, that 7 is greater than x. So notice that it's opening up to the 7. It has to continue opening up to the 7. Does that make sense? Okay. And that's probably the trickiest part of this whole assignment, because you're not going to ever multiply or divide by a negative, which means you're never really going to flip the inequality on this homework. We'll do it on future homeworks. Now, which graph would that be? X is less than or equal to 7 over here. That would be B. Less than or equal to, that implies a solid dot. This is an open dot that does not have a solid line underneath it. Less than or equal to 7, less than's to the left. So B's your correct answer. They're really all that easy. Let's take a look at number 3. All right, number 2 looks a little challenging. Why not? Let's do number 2. Let's get rid of the... How about this? You guys have options. You could move this 4x over here by subtracting 4x and subtracting 4x. But you always want the x on the left side. So you might want to waste a little more time by doing more steps, but moving the x over to this side. So check it out. I could subtract 5x. Cancels. Subtract 5x. You'll have negative 1x plus 3 is less than nothing. That'd be a 0. So then I'd have to get rid of that 3 by subtracting 3. Subtracting 3. And I will have a negative 1x is less than negative 3. Is everybody with me? Mm-hmm. Okay, now, so I kind of did this on purpose so we could actually use that rule that we had on our notes. What do I have to do for my last step here? Divide by a negative 1. Divide by a negative 1. So x, and since we divided by a negative, you'd have to flip that inequality symbol, and it would become positive 3. So x is greater than positive 3 is your answer. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. So I could have moved the 4x over there and then switched it at the very end. But I kind of wanted to show you that if you do divide by a negative, you have to flip that inequality symbol. X is greater than 3. Which multiple choice answer would that be? D. X is greater than 3. Not greater than or equal to. That would be a solid dot. It's just greater than. That's why it's an open dot. Greater than goes to the right. Let's check out number 3, because there's a mistake actually on this worksheet. When we do number 3, we're going to subtract 7x. Subtract 7x. You're going to end up with x is greater than negative 4, correct? And that's it. That's your answer. Now, if you take a look at your multiple choices over here, x is greater than negative 4. The only one that's similar to that is A, but there's a mistake because this should have been an open dot right here. And they put it as solid. So that was a typo on the book manufacturer's fault. It was their error. So that should have been an open dot. Please make that note right there.